In December, US inflation hit 7%, the highest rate since 1982. Questions surrounding the presidency of Joe Biden have been held by the American public for a lack of focus on the US's economic stance. While COVID-19 remains to be a problem, the issue of tackling the economy is what has led us to today's topic of US inflation. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the half hour. As always, it's Spencer.
And I'm YuYu. And today we also have a special guest joining us because it is the 20th episode. So I would like to welcome Ian Fletcher to today's podcast episode.
Happy to be here.
Just to let everybody know beforehand, Ian is somebody who has done speech for 4 years. He mostly did policy and international Extemp, but he was involved a little bit in domestic, informative speaking, public forum, and Extemp debate, obviously when offered in Wyoming. He is a 2-time national qualifier in international Extemp, once in national qualifier in policy, and 3 times Extemp Tournament of Champions qualifier and attended it once. This is his last semester of his undergraduate at the University of Wyoming. He's studying economics and mathematics, and he's currently planning to continue education by working towards a master's in economics at the University of Wyoming, maybe Arizona or Utah in the fall. So very credible resource for Extemp, a great person to talk about U.S. inflation today. So it is great to have you on, Ian. Before we get into anything, first off, if you're not subscribed to that YouTube channel, if it doesn't have that red button, click it. Or if it does have the red button, click it. It's important. It helps us out. Maybe we can pay our college tuition.
Ring the bell.
Remember, if everybody that is subscribed to the channel subscribes and everybody that's not subscribed to the channel subscribes, that means we'd have 7 billion subscribers. Please help us out. Hey, anyway, without any further ado, Ian, the floor is yours.
Perfect. I think one of the most important things, especially when beginning to talk about inflation, is just to kind of figure out like really what it is, right? Like everybody knows that it's a buzzword that's thrown around the news a lot. Talked about by politicians as a way to both criticize and support presidencies and other colleagues and whatever. But really, the president has nothing to do with inflation. He can lobby, he can negotiate, he can do whatever. But ultimately, the laws and the governance and the changing of inflation all comes down to the central banks and the Fed. And so really, just before we dive all this kind of in, I think that it's important that we set kind of like what the Federal Reserve does and kind of like all sorts of that aspect before we really get into the meat and potatoes. So what I'm going to do really quick is just kind of go through what the Federal Reserve does. And I might refer to it as the central bank because that's really what it is. But so the Fed does control inflation rates, yes, but it's not in the sense that most people think. For the average American, they think that inflation rates are like really just targets to hit, like benchmarks, but rather the Fed uses these as tools to make the economy function. So the Fed has lots of tools like this. They can use inflation rates, interest rates, exchange rates, all sorts of stuff. But something cool about the central bank is that they're an independent arm of the government, which means that their really only check is by Congress through the passage of laws. And they affect the money supply in the economy through open market operations, which is one of the only ways that they can publicly influence the money supply. And other means by affecting the money available for private banks. So essentially, the money enters the system from the central bank, and then it circulates through the economy by standard transactions. Think like buying gas at a gas station. The creation of printing of money creates no new wealth in the economy. So the more dollar bills that are circulating doesn't make the United States more rich. But the transactions supported by those new bills do create value. And the new money enters the circuit through purchasing of government bonds, primarily held by private banks, those open market operations. Moreover, the money gets then into the public through loans by the bank, and these transactions then create more new value in the economy. So really, that's how the Federal Reserve makes the United States GDP grow and also becomes indebted to other countries as well. So now with that established, I think it's worth noting like what money is really and why inflation rates tend to scare Americans. Money comes in 2 forms: fiat money, like paper bills, and commodity money. Think like gold or cigarettes in prison. Fiat money works on the assumption that somebody else will accept it. And for most transactions, you don't actually need the physical amount of money, just a unit of your account, so like a debit card. Now, to the money supplier, the currency in circulation. Now, to open the money supply, you need the currency in circulation and all of the demand deposits held by citizens and the foreign banks that own them. So the money in circulation and also the potential held by government bonds. The central bank is going to buy or sell those same government bonds to ensure that the fiat money system still stays afloat and that the dollar is credible. Think one situation where the central bank didn't work is, if you remember, in Tanzania, when the Tanzanian dollar, they were almost working on the United States dollar and not their own currency. And that's because their central bank didn't support their own central currency as well. The Federal Reserve has three main goals. The dual mandate that was established way back when the Federal Reserve was first made, which forces the Federal Reserve to attempt to maximize employment and maintain stable prices in the long term. But recently, they've also wanted to keep the long-term interest rates low as a better borrowing for all citizens. All Federal Reserve decisions and operations are done through the Federal Open Market Committee, which is a committee of 12 people plus the chair and the vice chair of the Federal Reserve. However, and this committee is the people who announce the interest rate targets and the use of open market operations when needed. However, these ideas don't really work well in practice, but a lot of what the government does can influence people's expectations. So whatever the Federal Open Market Committee wants to do, they have a direct plan to do it, but it would only really work in a vacuum just because of how much people's expectations influence the economy, which people's expectations can do everything from leading people to buy more to people hoarding bills and slowing down the recovery process. Like, if you remember at the start of the pandemic, if you ever went into a gas station, they probably asked you to pay with a debit card or an exact change because there was a national coin shortage. And that's because when people go into a pandemic or into a recession, people will tend to hoard all of their money because they do think that the money is going to crash and the economy is going to crash, which is going to make their dollar less credible. So if they have more of it in their hand, it makes them feel better, even though that's not really how that works either. But while the Federal Reserve does target interest rate, historically, the Federal Reserve has not set their target inflation rate. On balance, it's usually around 2%. And this is calculated by using personal consumption expenditures, which is just a flexible basket of goods without food and without gasoline that changes the cost from year to year. Now, the Federal Reserve can do a couple things when it comes to maintaining the economy or meeting their goals. They can use forward guidance, which is just supposed to describe their current target levels that the Federal Open Market Committee is trying to achieve. But that's literally just talking. That's like making an announcement to the news. But additionally, they can also change the required reserve ratio that banks have to hold. But it usually doesn't, the Federal Reserve doesn't usually do this because it could potentially lead to runs on bank, think like the 1930s. But for the most part, the Fed runs on the central idea of use the knowledge that you have and recognize the knowledge that you don't. And in any situation where you don't have the exact knowledge, do your best for what you don't know. And so I guess let's really quick jump back to the instruments the Fed has to use in its influence to the economy. The Fed can use the money supply, which is what the primary source and where inflation is mostly held. They can hold federal funds rate, which is just another fancy way to say all interest rates. They can use nominal exchange rates, which is exchange rates with foreign currency. And they can use bank reserves to influence the economy. That's the reserve ratio that we just talked about. To choose what instruments to use, they often use this concept called pools analysis, which is named after an old economist, which makes the policymakers choose between interest rates or money supply to lower the volatility in GDP given a shock to the economy. And those shocks come from either the money market or the goods market. But prior to 1990, you could use different types of money supply. There were 4 different types of money supply. But after 1990, it became too volatile and too risky to consistently predict using 3 out of the money supplies. So really, since then, the Federal Reserve has just used interest rates to go. But this leads to the debate between whether or not the Fed should be forced to follow the rules or if the action should be led up to the discretion of the Federal Reserve. But really, I think that that's kind of the background needed for the inflation discussion. And so then that's kind of the quick cliff notes that you need in the history and what the Federal Reserve does to kind of influence and address inflation rates in and of itself.
Yeah, that's perfect. It leads really well into my discussion of what currently is going on with inflation. So now that we know more about the intricacies of it, we can talk more about why people care about it and the controversy or recent news that you might have heard about or we've all had heard about. First and foremost, you'll probably hear that it's one of the biggest reasons why Biden's popularity as president is low right now. The thought process behind that is mainly people think inflation is bad because they notice the short-term effects of that high inflation. However, it's not really directly caused by the president, like Ian said. It's just kind of their perception of what's going on during one's presidency. So, for example, if you go to the store one day, milk is $1, and then the next day it's $2. People will obviously not be happy with what they deem as just a price increase for something that they've always gotten for that same price. They will won't be thinking about the long term or reasoning behind why inflation got so high, except that it has something to do with Biden's presidency, maybe. But something that is important to bring into the discussion about fears of inflation is that wages aren't meeting the increase of inflation, which is extremely harmful to the consumer as it decreases their purchasing power. Not enough money means you can't spend as much, but when these products are at higher places, it's harder to get everything you need. It's not just products, but also homes and other industries that are also experiencing price hikes. And with the stagnation of wage growth not being able to meet inflation growth, this has been an issue for a while and isn't as recent as some tend to think it is. It has only accumulated more attention because of the negative effects of COVID on our economy and productivity. So there's always going to be a connection between high inflation and probably recession, and that's always on people's minds. What's particular about this situation today is people are considering the possibility that inflation is rising while the economy is slowing down, in what economists would usually call stagflation. We're not there yet, and we probably won't be for a couple of reasons that we'll talk about later. But regardless, it's something that's on the consumer's mind, but also on policymakers' minds. If you look more specifically about how that's affecting policymaking decisions, Joe Manchin cited high inflation as the main or even central reason of why he won't support the Build Back Better bill that Biden proposed. He was afraid that massive spending and taxation required to support this bill would exacerbate inflation rates, contributing more to the problem. It is good to note that Manchin's fears of rising inflation are not misguided. Prices are higher than what they were before, and so is inflation. But most experts agree that either this bill won't influence inflation that much, or that you shouldn't vote based on if a bill will influence inflation or not. However, it's not all doom and gloom as most people think either. Things are actually looking up in terms of economic growth, like what Ian was talking about. For starters, demand hasn't decreased dramatically during high inflation, and people are still buying things, which just means that this is a sign that the economy isn't slowing down and stagflation won't happen. Demand is also slowly decreasing back to normal levels pre-COVID, and supply is also increasing to meet back up with that demand. Most believe that the global supply chain won't be as strained as when COVID first hit with the Omicron surge that's happening now. With that, people are starting to become less concerned with inflation, but still concerned about the Fed hiking up interest rates and how that will affect them in the future. I think right now they're thinking about hiking up the interest rates 3 times in 2022 and then 3 more times in 2023. But at the moment, that's all we really know about what's currently going on with inflation and what people think about it.
Yeah, really quick, you mentioned stagflation, and I think that that's important to note that in order to cure stagflation, if we do get to that point, the Fed really has to choose between 2 options. They can either focus on the GDP and save the United States as a whole, or they have to focus on prices and try to save the consumer's pocket. That kind of leads into that question of discretion or rules, right? Like if it's up to the Federal Reserve, they can make that decision. But with discretion, you can raise your aggregate demand and sacrifice inflation rates to fix your GDP. But with a rule, the Fed is just focused, is just forced to sit and do nothing and wait for the stagflation to kind of go away and fix itself. And this avoids an increase in inflation, but it really, really, really takes a long time, like 20 plus years. And so you would see this 7% inflation for a very long time if the Fed Reserve does nothing. Increase in inflation rates initially in order to combat stagflation is the perfect result to maintain prices low and GDP high.
All right, and I think that is a perfect transition into the possible questions. Let's go ahead and jump into the first one. And this question is, will a reduction of the Fed's quantitative easing program substantially lower inflationary pressures in the U.S. economy? It's very wordy. We're going to read that again. Will a reduction of the Fed's quantitative easing program substantially lower inflationary pressures in the U.S. economy? And we're going to go ahead and start with Ian. And Ian, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm reading an article right here. Quantitative easing program. This is the method of having short-term reduction of interest rates, correct?
Yeah, it's the process. So I mentioned open market operations where they buy and sell government bonds. That's really all quantitative easing is. It's just a fancy way to say it. The Federal Reserve, the St. Louis Fed Reserve, calls it a large-scale purchasing of assets by central banks. This leads to a large increase in the Fed Reserve's balance sheet during global financial crises like the one in 2007 and in the long-term recovery that we saw in 2009 through 2011. Over the same period, quantitative easing played a very important role in other central banks around the world, countries like Japan. Quantitative easing remains a key instrument to monetary policy. It's an unconventional policy tool that central bankers can potentially use, really when all else fails. The public policy discussion suggests that quantitative easing is likely to be used again right now, and by a Federal Reserve and other central banks in a future recession or financial crisis, which is why you asked the question today. So yeah, quantitative easing is a great way to combat inflation, but really it's just kind of the use of buying and selling government bonds, essentially keeping that money flowing.
What's talked about already, great way to kind of reduce inflationary pressures in the US economy. I have read some articles that mention that maybe the Fed doesn't have a great grasp on exactly managing like those bonds that they're buying and selling. And in which case it creates a lot of, worry among consumers and even policymakers about how exactly this could either decrease the inflation pressures or whether or not they have a good grasp on that mechanism too. And I'm pretty sure Ian would have some response to that, and Spencer probably has some thoughts too, but that's just something I read about.
Yeah, Spencer, if you want to respond, since I've already had my turn, go for it, if you have anything.
Well, if you've actually met me, I actually believe that the central bank should just be abolished. So personally, because I find its use to just be, and this is just my honest opinion, its use is not very productive in a real world sense, right? We've seen over the course of history that the creation of central banks actually can lead to the demolishing of regular countries, and there's actual physical evidence of this out there that exists. Besides the point, the question isn't about that. The more bigger purpose that's here is whether or not this is going to be a good stance and this is a good idea. And personally, just looking at the inflationary pressures and buying of government bonds, this is very productive. I do think that this will lead to a very good outcome and that our economy will definitely benefit from this. It will help ease inflationary pressures. And just reading the article that I've got pulled up now, this is a very simple solution to what can be a pretty big complex problem if not taken care of properly. But once again, if people have actually met me, I am absolutely against the central bank. I'm against the Fed, which is kind of a crazy belief. That's one of my stronger libertarian stances. But yeah, absolutely. I think this is a good process just in terms of regular theory and how it honestly goes about.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that strong libertarian beliefs fully support your belief. The Fed does a lot of work to do all this kind of stuff, and central bank independence is significantly correlated at a 0.8 percentage, with the Pearson's R of 0.8, in which the countries with higher central bank independence have lower inflation rates over time, and the inverse is also true. So countries with lower central bank independence typically have higher inflation rates over time because more companies are allowed to dictate the economy, and you're going to see higher prices regardless of whether or not, if the federal bank does disappear. And you have a lot of the irreversibility problems. Right. So the central bank doesn't really have instrument independence like people like to think they do. Essentially, they don't really get to choose their own policies that they get to do. While they are an independent arm of the government, they don't do a lot. But without the central bank, you are going to have a lot of those irreversibility problems where banks are allowed to choose and dictate their own policies, which leads to that liquidity problem that quantitative easing is actually used to help. So really quick before we move on past quantitative easing, we're seeing it right now. When COVID started in March of 2020, the Fed did a couple of things to immediately combat, and it was lessons that they learned from 2008 at the beginning of the Obama administration that the Fed kind of lacked on, and was one of the reasons why when many people thought Obama was going to be a one-term president, because the slow growth rate coming out of the housing bubble. But immediately when COVID started, Trump lowered interest rates to almost zero. that ensured liquidity in the short run. That made sure that money was in people's pockets. They were worrying and all this kind of stuff. But then they also began the quantitative easing progress to ensure that there was liquidity throughout the long run. And we haven't seen very much liquidity problems outside of the national coin shortage that lasted just a couple of months. He opened credit to everybody. There was the Biden put in place the eviction moratorium, the pause on student loan payments, all of the non-necessary payments. All of this kind of stuff was the central and integral portions that had strong influence from the central bank, which is, I think, important to note when we discuss these kind of things.
I think before we end up going to the next question, one thing that I want to add is we're talking a lot about government bonds, and I think it is probably something to note about how like what are bonds, right? Because it is a good question that some people may have, and kind of in terms of like why it's good to buy government debt in some way or another. And one thing I want to mention is I've actually read a book by a very famous economist by the name of Paul Krugman. I'm pretty sure Ian's heard of this guy. He's a Nobel Peace Prize winner 2008. Incredibly smart economist, writes a lot of articles still today. I'll put that book in the sources for this video. But one of the things he discusses is how when you look at like government debt is really not a bad thing. And he puts out this claim of we see debt in general as actually a very productive thing. When you have a recession or an economic collapse, kind of like what we have had because of COVID, what happens is you tend to see GDP fall. And as a result of that, you have to be able to make up that GDP somehow because you have lost money that exists in the system. And how you typically fix that is through stimulus. And he explains, this was a book published in 2012, how in 2012, the problems of 2008 were never solved because that stimulus was never really created to rebound the economy that was lost. And we can make that same argument probably today because we really haven't had the trillions of dollars that have been lost from 2020 and 2021 for this point of matter now that have been recovered. You can argue that Biden has passed very good, massive bills that have provided stimulus to the economy, but it just hasn't met it. So the Fed buying debt is a very good thing, because it helps to ease that inflationary pressure. And that's what people should kind of understand in general, is that this quantitative easing program is there as can be a very good thing so we can push more stimulus, because we need that stimulus to help rebound the economy.
Yep. If you're like me and you have no idea about the intricacies of econ and what any of this means, that's okay. Simply put, look at history, look at what the US has done, and in terms of just like dealing with inflation, rising super, super high, or like how they dealt with like recessions and like jump back from recessions, in which case, this is exactly what they did. It was pretty successful. So when answering this question, I would say it's pretty like straight to the bone. It's a yes.
Oh yeah, 100%. And I think that if we still have enough time, if we need to move on to the next question, I totally get it. But I think it's worth noting really quick, when the economy is not running at the full capacity, like Spencer said, that meant that there was unused labor or resources. This is really kind of the other side of the coin, right? Like we're not spending as much as we were losing. And so inflation is theoretically helps to increase that production. More dollars into the economy translates to more spending, which equates to more aggregate demand. More demand in turn triggers more production to meet that demand. And it's this big loop, right? And another famous economist, the British economist John Maynard Keynes, believed that inflation was necessary to prevent this thing called the Paradox of Thrift, which said that if consumer prices were allowed to fall consistently because the country was becoming too productive, then consumers learned to hold off their purchases to wait for a better deal. And the net effect of this paradox is to reduce aggregate demand, leading to less productions, less layoffs, and a faltering economy, which I think is kind of funny to note. But like you said, if you're ever wondering what to do, just look at some historical portions. And since World War II, the United States has had 6 different six different ways and experiences to look at. You had the post-World War II removal of price controls, supply constraints, and an uptick in demand in just about everything. You have just after the Korean War, you have the 1960s expansion, the 1970s expansion, in which inflation was growing, wars were being paid with fiscal policy, not with debt, like Spencer mentioned. Nixon abandoned the gold standard. There was massive oil shocks. This led to a time inconsistency problem. Nixon said that he would do something, but when the time came, nothing happened. Forced conversations to consider forward thinking and expectations. Even the invasion of Iraq, Kuwait, and all of Desert Storm in the 2008 oil stocks, the housing crisis, all of that kind of stuff. All of those are good examples that might have happened recently that you might know something about that you can use as a point of reference to learn about today.
And I think that is the purpose of our podcast. You get both sides. Let's move on to that next question. And that next question is going to be, how can the U.S. economy better weather future strains of the COVID-19 virus? Now, it's a very open-ended question. Hey, we know that we've had an economic downfall because of COVID-19 back in 2020. Admittedly, we do also know that that downfall happened right in February, so it was right before it really hit the U.S., but COVID-19 obviously made it worse. Good place to start with Ian. Kind of interesting. Do you expect more strains of COVID-19 to really stop the U.S. economy?
So I think that if the United States economy keeps doing I don't think it's going to be as bad as everybody thinks it's going to be, but that's where you kind of get into the financial side, right? So finance is how to make more money, like maximize wealth, whereas economics is really just kind of like how to maximize well-being, right? So I think if the United States keeps on its current course, the economy will be fine, but I think public health will be sacrificed in it, right? So you always have a trade-off with something, right? You either make money or you make people healthy, right? Healthcare is expensive. There's no doubt behind that. But what we've seen every portion of the U.S. economy being significantly impacted. The mega corporations are doing just fine. But no matter how you measure it, the leisure and hospitality was the hardest hit in the pandemic. In March of 2020, both that sector lost 8.2 million jobs in March and April combined. The leisure and hospitality sector has seen a modest bounce back since then, but a large shortfall remains as of February of 2021. Leisure and hospitality lost nearly 3.5 million jobs, or 20.4% of its entirety. And so we're seeing losses in just about everything. Leisure is losing a ton of jobs. The government lost a ton of jobs. Education and health services. You don't see as much in mining and logging, utilities, transportation, and warehouse stuff. But all of these are from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Economic Policy Institute. And they just say that, like, if this continues, you're going to see those sectors continue to suffer. But ultimately, we haven't seen that much of an economic downturn that the global economy was expecting and anticipating. And so that supply shock that occurred didn't really reach the rest of the demand, even though a lot of theories and a lot of mathematics would have said that it would have. People are still buying at the rate that they were at the beginning, is another way to put that, regardless of what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of hate this question because it's a tongue twister. But what I would kind of just say to that would just be like, the United States can probably have its cake and eat it too, just because it could focus on what something Ian talked about, which is maybe focusing more on public health. And in that way, you can focus on public health, get the public healthier so that they can actually go back and be more productive for the economy, work, make money, buy things, all that good jazz. But you necessarily need to focus on public health by maybe increasing vaccines, or increasing the amount of people who get vaccines, or thinking about maybe COVID restrictions that would kind of encourage healthier, atmospheres to be in. Because if you don't have healthy workers, then it's hard to run that business because you don't have those workers there since they're sick. So that could be another way to look at it.
I love the hypothetical, so we're going to throw it out there. So one way that the U.S. economy could is through the gig economy. Okay? And you can make this idea of COVID-19 may never go away, right? And it's maybe something we could live with. It is a discussion that is had. It is something that is being debated upon. Hey, admittedly, all pandemics do come to an end, but there could be like future strains of like what could be considered a coronavirus that may connect to it. And we can go all the way back to this very second episode of our podcast series where I went through the entirety of like the history of the Spanish flu and explained how it's still here today, how we know that strains of the Spanish flu still exist, right? We can bring and draw back that debate. But educating people on the gig economy, such as if this podcast was to make money, right, would be a really good way of having a new form of an economic expansion. Hey, and I don't think that this is just generally an issue of health, hey, because maybe the best answer is through online communication or through the use of new developments through the economy. We can talk all day here about going into how blockchain has expanded through 2020 and 2021. We can go into the new discussion of the metaverse here. We can really expand on how, like, in the last 2 years, the things that have made tons of money and that have really expanded the economy is in the gig economy and can really be a very good starting point for seeing maybe like having an education on how this gig economy works and getting people used to it could actually be an answer to if this thing never really goes away. But obviously this is the hypothetical that that it will always stay.
I think that if we're really considering the public opinion right now on vaccines and all that kind of stuff, I think that it is more possible than not that COVID is never going to go away, or some version of COVID is going to get away. And I don't disagree with what you're saying. But I do think that if we fully support and fully embrace the gig economy, it works in a vacuum, right? If the United States existed by itself, it would work. But if you fully embrace the gig economy, then you completely exclude all developing countries or people without the infrastructure to engage in the metaverse or to engage in Bitcoin mining from even participating in the global economy. So you have countries like Russia, China, the United States, India, the European Union. Those guys thrive, they survive. But then you have the entire continent of Africa, you have the Eastern European states, you have the entire continent of South America even, that don't have the infrastructure to fully engage in the metaverse. And so, I mean, yes, it is a good solution for the United States and first world countries, the people who lead the world. But ultimately, you're gonna steal the cake from everybody else.
I think that's a really real possibility. But then again, this question is like US focused, in which you don't necessarily have to care about like everybody else in the world. However, you should care about everybody else in the world. Just saying that if you thought of this as a possible answer to the question, you could do it because it's just like US based if you want to go down that hypothetical route. But if not, one of the answers that Ian or I have given you are also very viable answers that are not based on hypotheticals.
I think ultimately with this discussion, we do have to remember that the economy isn't just based. It's just not just based on what we typically think of when we say economy, right? Because we typically think, oh, I go to work, I go and do my productive labor and I make money and people buy stuff, right? We like that's a very broad, bad definition of the economy, and Ian can tell you that right now. Okay. But it is important to remember that technology has played a very important role in the economy, and especially in the last 2 years, and probably what looks to be probably a good portion of this year too. And it is important not to outweigh the thought of what is the gig economy and what has kind of began to, or what has really accelerated. And I think that is a very good discussion to have when thinking about economics in general now. I think the gig economy is a very valuable discussion point, and it's no longer just about your regular day-to-day job. It's now about people listening to podcasts that can actually make money, or people using metaverse to allow the option for people to take place with their avatar and communicate through a business via an avatar. Or we can discuss the realm of creating what is called a DAO, which is a decentralized autonomous organization, or you can go along the lines of whatever. But the gig economy is something that is really important to start remembering, because as we go further, this is something that's not going away. And we know it's not. It's here to stay. And at this point in time, with how much it's expanded, like the pandemic really has brought it to the table of, don't forget about the gig economy. It's still here.
Okay. I think that nicely wraps up the episode. We've mentioned a lot of information for you to digest. A lot of it was new information, probably a lot of it old information, but nonetheless, it's important in helping you understand more about economics topics, especially when doing like domestic questions and domestic extemp. So on that note, I hope you get the one in the round. Oh, before I do that, thank you to Ian for coming and doing this episode. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your information and your expertise. But yeah, I hope you get the one in the round. If you don't get the one in the round, that's okay. Tell us how you did. Tell us how we did. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to DM either me, Spencer, or Ian. We're all available on our Instagram, and we're all willing to help talk to you, etc., etc. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit the bell so that you don't miss videos, and also, don't forget, you're great. Thanks for listening. Follow our socials.
Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, we will see you all later.